Associates, Architects and Planners in 1975. He's taught architecture at the University of Toronto, the University of Waterloo, has lectured extensively in Canada and the United States, has served as a magazine editor for Architecture Canada, has served on a number of awards juries, both for that magazine and for progressive architecture. And his work, done both on his own and with his Diamond and Myers, has won numerous awards, both in this country and in Canada. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Barton Myers to talk to us a little bit about vacant lottery. Is that right? Thank you.
Can you hear up there, all right? Okay, good. After that introduction, all of those things are how you survive when there's no employment. Tonight I want to talk about two of my interests at the moment. One is the city, and the other is architecture. And you probably ask, why should you separate them? And I think you're correct, you can't. Consequently, probably two lectures I'm trying to compress into one. But I really think it's about time that when we talk about architecture, we talk about context. So the idea of vacant lottery is to show you 10 vacant lots, 10 projects, which illustrate, I think, a series of things we're doing which have prototypical implications for architecture and urban planning. Before I do that, I thought I'd tell you a few things about ourselves, give you some ideas of what we're trying to do architecturally, because when I go through the slides, I'm not going to go through in any detail about any particular project. Each time I'll choose to illustrate a particular point or a particular idea that we feel is important. First of all, we're a very small firm, what we call a core firm. It means that we are basically architects and planners, and we will marry ourselves with expertise as necessary to take on a very great diversity of work. And we've been very fortunate, had a lot of good help, particularly in the field of behavioral sciences and in the field of cost estimating and economics. In fact, I would say that the firm's, one of the firm's successes really understanding the economic and market situation, which has allowed us to perform as quote, high-style designers in that field. I think I'm probably one of the few people that you will see that has been able to combine both scales of work, from kitchen renovations to new towns. And that's how we like it. Our interest has been in the marketplace, and we really set out to try to perform at an economic level and not deal with at the level of economics which a very isolated, very small percentage of work is being done. Consequently, as I mentioned, design and cost relationship has become a very important thing to us. And although I'm not an economist, I think probably some of the economic work we've done in housing and urban design is about as sophisticated as you will find, and has been effective. Fourth point, which I think is important, that there's a very different kind of user-client relationship. Unlike the days when I went through school and what the master said basically went, we're not the Michelangelo syndrome. We do not come down with the 10 commandments about architecture, but really have had very smart clients and very good clients and rely very heavily on their input. And I think that's been an exciting thing. We've learned a tremendous amount from that. And there's no doubt to the cliche that behind every good piece of architecture there's a good client. The fifth point that I think you'll look for, and something that I've been amazed about, something I didn't think we could do, and something I really encourage you to look into, is the fantastic power you have as a communicator. particularly in graphically being able to illustrate alternatives to people. And I think the success we've had in Canada to demonstrate alternatives in housing and urban form has come to our finding and discovery of how to be able to illustrate ideas and get them to the public so the public understand what the issues are about. Consequently, is our interest in prototypical work, things that have implications beyond the very particular project that we're doing. Now, our attitude is probably complex, and I've tried to summarize it this way and give you a few things to look for in the slides. If I don't talk about them anyway, you'll can check them off. One is that we work at two levels. Basically, the first level is dealing in fundamental principles or issues, and basically what anyone tries to find out what to do. And the second level, the tough concern about decision making, about how you do things, why you do them, what we call basically, how to do it. Four things I think you can look for. One is our interest in context, climate. Maybe as a southerner who's immigrated north, I'm particularly sensitive to the cold, so it's had a big impact on our work. A kind of attitude about technology, which I'll talk about in a minute. And finally, interest in architectural and urban traditions. Under context, which we'll go through in considerable detail, is really our interest in how, as architects and planners, we can build on what we have rather than destroying and having to create anew. In this, you will see our concern, respect for existing rights, respect for buildings, fabric, interest in incremental growth, intensification, better density distribution patterns of how we live, old-new combinations as a very strong device for architecture, fit, tradition, historical model, pop culture, and climate. All of these interlock and form the work. Of all the projects I've done, I have never done an isolated building except for a house, which is in fact a row house. So all of our buildings are linked buildings or connected buildings. We've never had a chance to do something like this building, for instance, which stands by itself. An interest in context is constraints. It's interesting that in planning, where we have the greatest freedom, we do the worst kind of work. Where we have the toughest kind of problems, we seem to do the best kind of work. So as a kind of design idea, we build very much on circumstance and constraint, and we find this a great way to make architecture accommodating, and which brings it a kind of life and interest which normally doesn't have in an ideal situation. I think that it's a very difficult thing to talk about, but we are very interested in the social implication of our work. And I know that's a very difficult thing to define, but basically there are three things. The interest that everything we do tries to have a prototypical implication, as I mentioned. Two is our interest in housing alternatives that reinforce neighborhoods, or reinforce the fabric rather than destroys them. And then three is at the architectural level, a kind of interest in being able to take things that we already have and use them better. There's a saying that we know more than we do, and the idea is how much can you do for how little. Climate, as I mentioned, is a very important element for us. Our energy solutions are not Buck Rogers stuff. We don't go after the solar systems. We go after trying to get housing together in clusters. The efficiency of a row house is tremendously greater than a detached house. We're going after public transportation to organize housing better with transportation. We go after buildings which are simple perimeters that are not highly articulated and act as radiators, and that we're looking for ways to work within big building envelopes to produce a kind of adjustable architecture, and I'll show you those in the slide. Our technology is not one of high tech, although the work will appear that way because there are open web steel joists and metal decking and things of that kind. But basically it's trying to make an elegant architecture, and elegant in the mathematical sense as well as the aesthetic sense of doing an appropriate, simple, natural kind of architecture. More is less, I guess, is the more with less is the kind of idea. The traditional one is an important one to us. And the more you get involved in cities and the more you get involved in architecture and you appreciate the evolutionary characteristics, the importance of the architectural tradition, particularly the sense of timeless as well as temporal, I think the better architect and planner you become. I think good architecture demands thoughtful assessment of very fundamental principles appropriately related to the circumstance. I mean, you've got to deal with where you're working. That sounds like an advocate for regional architecture, and I think that's true. And basically, architecture, as John Summerson has so well said, architecture past, present, and future is invisible. Okay, that's a quick run-through of a series of ideas, a kind of manifesto of where we stand on architecture. Now, tonight, I want to talk a little bit, if I can have those two projectors on. Okay, great. See if I can see without killing myself. Tonight, I want to talk about urban consolidation, which is basically an issue of how to deal with growth and, in many cases, non-growth. And the issue can be talked about very simply about density, which means how much, and distribution, about how you handle density, how you spread it out. Now, I think everybody knows, I think after the 8th grade, you know that the same fluid can be held in many different shapes and volumes. What all architects should know that all of these are the same volume, and yet there are many different ways of handling that density and distribution. The one that Le Corbusier, for instance, in the Marseille block challenge is the high-density high-rise. All of these are the same density distribution patterns. This is an example of the Mies van der Rohe Toronto Dominion Center in Toronto. At this stage, there are 100 floors. That can be distributed in 16 floors with a huge court that would make some of John Portman's look small. So that's just basically saying that all of us know there are different ways of skinning the cat, and that, let's see if I can get forward and backwards here. Okay. But unfortunately, many people don't know that. And the preoccupation with, good, if you can focus those up there, that'd be great. The preoccupation of architects who want to recreate the wheel is a constant one. An example of that, this is Habitat in Montreal, which is 18 dwelling units an acre. Now, 18 dwelling units an acre can be built in very simple 2- and 3-story row housing. So here's a project that is a reputation of being innovative and high density, when in fact it could be simply done in row housing. The other one, we talked about energy. These are density distribution patterns. Up at the top is urban, suburban, 3 to 5 DU per acre. And the drawing on the right shows cluster housing and the amount of effective open space that one gains. When you look at energy losses, for instance, the perimeter is the key element. In a detached house of 900 square feet, it has 120 square foot of perimeter. In a row house of the same area, you have 50. So one is about 60% more efficient than the next. Important lessons in very simple density distribution. Now, what we're going to talk about is the same issue at a larger scale as a city. And in North America, we have accepted an attitude that we are going to write the city off. In fact, the city is nothing but a service station. It's a place where you bring immigrants into and you acculturate them and then you ship them to the suburbs. Our view of that is that's ridiculous, and that cities are in fact the greatest art form that we have, that they're one of the few collective expressions where a lot of us make it. They're very important, and we've been on a campaign for 10 years to try to make the city a better place. Now, the classic North American city is one which is called a uni-centered urban sprawl city. We have a high-density core in the middle, and we have acres and acres of urban sprawl around the outside. This is a cartoon of that. The center of that is representing high density. This is a section at the bottom. we build at radical densities in the core, high densities, and extremely low densities in the periphery area. We by now know what the cost implications, both economic and financial, of this very inefficient system. The high cost in transportation. In fact, public transportation is impossible. There's no way you can make it work with the densities that we have. We know the problems of the duplications of new sewers servicing roads, schools. We know about the destruction of the inner-core neighborhoods that get the expressways downtown. We know the problem of the city being highly diversified at one time, turning into a very specialized center of either office space and institutional uses, or a city for the very old or the very young, families being able to move out. The alternative to that is an older form, which is referred to as the multi-centered city. And on the right shows a different kind of diagram. Instead of these radically different density distributions of high in the center and low on the outside, it has a more evenly distributed pattern, and it has a center, but it also has sub-centers. And instead of, say, housing at 100 dwelling units an acre or 300 people per acre, it might have 50 or 60 in the middle. And it has lower valleys and peaks, many more of them. And because of this even distribution system, you can support things like transit and mixed land use, housing for families, and in fact, it has many more economic and social possibilities to it. Now, the origins of the unicentered city are complex. One can simply say that we know the impact of the Garden City, and that the idea picked up in the early 20th century by the moderns, in particular Le Corbusier, and the idea of turning the city into park space and building these high-density schemes. And you see Le Corbusier was very honest about it. The intersection of this scheme for Paris is in fact a highway intersection. This is the ultimate city, San Francisco, where every architect does his thing. The kind of base that's left in the city. In fact, I think recommended reading to you should be The Ultimate High Rise, which is a book about the economics of San Francisco and why these things don't work. Now that idea has been transmitted everywhere. In fact, if it wasn't such a cancer, I wouldn't be here talking about it. This is Edmonton, Alberta, a population of 450,000, and it's typical of the Canadian city. Most of it built since 1945, all of it high density, and the same time with suburban sprawl very similar to Levittown, which has been the idea here, the American dream of everybody having his detached house. The results of the new cities, whether they're Houston or Dallas, the new cities are pretty dreadful. This is what downtown Houston looks like. Again, that kind of diversity, that life that made the cities great is no longer there. Mirrored glass buildings and very little activity. Now, in many American cities, it's probably too late to do anything. In some Canadian cities, there's still time. So one of the interests we've had in Canada is to preserve the kind of diversity we have, to preserve our cities, and not go the Dallas-Houston prototypical high-density urban core. This is Yorkville, Toronto, and very typical of very large extents of Toronto and the kind of streetscape that still exists there. The one on the right is the new Embarcadero Center at San Francisco. Again, the street is abandoned to the automobile. Raised platforms and elevation, which are difficult, and plus 15 levels that are very difficult. And a lot of the simple ideas that have existed for a long time of concentration of people and integration of systems are here separated out to really the disadvantage of both. Needless to say, I'm a great Jane Jacobs fan, and I've enjoyed knowing Jane Jacobs since she immigrated to Toronto, and she's had a great influence on the work. Anyway, the stuff that we pay a lot of money to go to Europe to see can happen here, and actually it is happening. The kind of Boston renewal, the Market Center, the Embarcadero, the San Francisco, the Cannery, and so forth. But the problem with that is that so much of it really is artificial, It's simply tourism and really doesn't get back to the kind of ideas of mixed use and mixed living in the city. Now, cities weren't always the way they are. This is Los Angeles. That is certainly the ultimate in sprawl city at low density, something like 3 to 5 dwelling units average across the city. This is Paris in the 17th, 18th century, which is built at about 10 times the density of what Los Angeles is built at. And that's pretty classic for the deterioration of density in the cities. This is Toronto in 1915. And I don't know whether you can read that increment, but each little piece of that is 100 people per acre. So you can see up really to the First World War, most of our cities were very dense, very compact, very consolidated cities. Now, just to give you a little background so you understand what we've been trying to do, and when I show you these projects, this has been a particular problem in Canada that we focus on, and we're just now beginning to address some of the American issues and planning work we're doing here. But every municipality, every city has to file a plan with the province. It's equivalent to the state, and the province has a lot of power. Canada's confederation, and the province wields a lot of power. Now, most of these plans are what's called blob diagrams. They're simply color-coded. Yellow is where you live, red is where you work for commercial, blue is industrial, and so forth. And new planning has tended to segregate out uses. Now, these plans were done in great haste, and no one really knows how they arrived at how much you should do in these cities. You know, how big should they be? How do you deal with densities? People like Edmund Bacon from Philadelphia went up to Ottawa, and he said, well, in Philadelphia, we build at 9 times density, which means you take the lot and you multiply by 9, and it tells you how much square footage you can put on it. And that worked well in Philadelphia, so Ottawa has 9 to 10 times density. Totally inappropriate for the scale of the city. Anyway, this official plan was filed, and then you were supposed to do a Part 2 study, which tested the kind of economic, social impact of the city. And that never happened. And the game was that in order to get to the development industry going quickly, they developed a bonus system. And the idea was that you acquired a bottom drawing, a big lot, and if you left more than 50% open space, you got a prize, and you put the parking on the ground, you got a prize. And pretty soon that the ideal form was that you would have a needle standing on a lot with 100% open space and all the cars underground, and you would get a tremendous prize. That encouraged high-density development and the worst kind. And this is one section of Toronto, this little gray area here, only one section of that blob diagram, which was zone high density. And I don't know whether you can see that, but this is what we do. We call them doomsday scenarios. And we draw the official plan and saying, here's what your official plan would look like if you were to build according to the zoning. And you talk about you want radical reform, that's the fast way to get it. And it really worked for us. The gray ones, West St. Jamestown, that are already built. You know, this was a famous drawing. It appeared at a court case saying, this is what your plan is going to lead to. Do you want to look like Manhattan? And of course, everybody said no, and it was part of the reform movement. But it illustrated a lot of the things that were wrong with the bonus system and also with the housing. Now, that's West St. Jamestown over there. And these are densities that are as high as Harlem, New York, and Hong Kong. And you say, my God, why in Canada? And this is Toronto, which is a good illustration of the tremendous density in the downtown core. The Royal York, which is this nice little thing with the copper roof. This is the Union Station. This is Mies in black, and Pay in silver, and Stone in marble. And they let a few local guys build here. This is the Great City Hall, which is international competition, which was the tallest building, I think, in 1965. So all of this. And then you can see all the, this is West St. Jamestown, and you can see all the high-rise, high density, which is all over the place. Basically, Toronto is a multi-centered city, and the issue is to protect those sub-centers and build them. So you have villages and small towns within the big city. The subway line goes out, and at every stop you get a high-density development. But it was this kind of mindless building which was destroying marvelous inner core neighborhoods that led us to speak out and become activists. Now, basically to me it was a very conservative mood, although we were seen for a long time to be radical. It was a conservative move, and simply to say that we had fantastic housing stock, this kind of housing in Toronto being replaced by high-density high-rise. This is Edmonton, Alberta, with the same kind of rules. And the amazing thing was, during the height of this revolution of rebuilding the city, the population of the city remained the same. We simply moved the families out and the singles in, and the density was exactly the same. We could have changed one bylaw which would permitted those old houses to go to multifamily and waive the parking requirement. We could have handled the same population. And that's really staggering. We were building 30,000 housing units a year. We're breaking all records on the continent for housing. One bylaw could have accommodated the same kind of density. Now, this kind of mania exists everywhere. Even the smallest fishing village, this is Bronte, Ontario, which is about an hour's drive from the city. When you read the goals and objective, you think you have the Gordon Cullen drawing of the ideal village. When you, in fact, you look at the graphics, the planning graphics, and the implication of the plan, you find that same blob diagram. And here's a town of 6,000 going 20, the same blob diagram with 100 dwelling units per acre in the center. Imagine 20,000 people, and they're going to put 100 dwelling units an acre in the center. And that is the doomsday drawing of Bronte, and unfortunately 50% of it's already built. So basically we had a major task on our hands, is how to reform this kind of ludicrous building we were doing. That slide is reversed upside down. But if you plotted the dots of the people in Bronte, you see that everybody lives in one place on the water's edge at very high density, and everybody else lives like all the other cities, one dot per person, kind of spreading on forever. And that's how much of Bronte that's already been built on the official plan. Now, I'm not going to talk about Bronte per se, but needless to say, we did official plan revision for Bronte with a better density distribution plan. But the basic idea was that two things. One is that there was a better way to deal with density, or at least there were alternatives to knocking everything down and putting high-rise, high density. In fact, high-rise, high density to most people is one word. You rarely see in planning anyone to say just high density. It's already high-rise, high density. We looked at a whole series of things. One is in ways to intensify where you had to take high density, how you could intensify the neighborhoods without destroying them. Two is how you used all that vacant and inefficient land that's not being used, such as rail yards, rail tracks, vacant spaces, and how you can actually rehab old buildings, warehouses, and the housing. So we looked at a whole series of things. All of this to tough economics. I mean, no just pie-in-the-sky design, really getting to the economic reasons. Now, these are going to be 10 quick projects, all vacant lots, and I thought I'd start with the first one, which is my house, which is very simple. You can fill in a vacant lot, and here's where you can do your thing as an architect. It's in the village of Yorkville, a modern front, existing in old houses. You really don't see it unless you're looking for it, and it was a demonstration on how to build on small lots. 25-foot lot by 118, to most people, is a very small lot. It's a courthouse doing two things, looking at prototypical ways of dealing in cold climate, using the heat trap and greenhouse, getting greenery into the house, exploration in cheap industrial warehousing kind of techniques, and three, it's prototypical for the student housing project, which I'll show you a little bit later, i.e. that if you extended the project this way and you ran a mall through where the dining room table is, you'd have the student housing. So I was able to test out all the problems about a leaky roof and things like that. Now, the house is an old-fashioned idea. Court housing is several thousand years old, and yet there are many good things about it. It was a very quick house, and I did it at a time when things were pretty inexpensive. And again, it was a test to take those ordinary things and make them an elegant architecture, and purposely contrasting, say, antique furniture against open web steel joists. Small garden, which I've now put a wall around it. But it gave me a chance. We used the house to experiment with detailing and techniques, and the house really would work well if we did 100 of them. This is another house. It's a modification, not the vacant lot thing, but I just wanted to digress a minute to show you another experiment in aluminum siding. Same kind of house in Rosedale. This is the record house this year. But it's another courthouse, but an open court into a very beautiful ravine with a view to the west, this way, up to Yonge and St. Clair. It's on fill, unstable soil, so it's on stilts, and there's eventually be a garden room in the back. But when we did the student housing, we bid 3 exterior surfaces, aluminum siding, stucco, and concrete were the only things we could afford. And metal siding came in quite a bit low. And the university rejected it on the grounds of aesthetics. So that this was an interesting experiment to test it in one of the major residential areas in Rosedale, Ontario. We haven't had any problems with it. It seemed to be well received. Again, it's not unlike my own house in the organization. But generally inside, simple envelope, but the detail and decoration come out of the putting together the parts, the joists, the lighting systems, the air system. And then we have a series of blinds that pull up and blinds that drop and doors that open and close. So there's quite a lot of adjustable work that can occur in these. The next step, obviously, was from the vacant lots of the whole sections of cities which can be subdivided. This is an area called the Beaches in Toronto. And Toronto has a nice street system. Much of it is a north-south axis that gives you good sunlight in the gardens. And it has the old lane system. And these are simple, very simple subdivision, which would take these underutilized lanes and increase the density. This would have a tremendous impact. And obviously, this is the way cities grew in the past. Philadelphia, for instance, the laneways were intensified in the latter part of the 19th century. London is famous for the conversion of carriage houses, mews housing. Basically, it's the way we grew was that kind of intensification. That alone would have had a major impact on Canadian cities. In fact, it has now become policy. In fact, Toronto has some of the most interesting housing policies. Many of the things I'm showing you now are all policies. This is another example where parking lots in the back where the old garages were now converted to parking lots could be infilled, is a jargon term where you put housing in the backyards. This is a simple scheme where these houses are maintained in courtyards in the back along mews. This achieves 50 dwelling units an acre, 150 people an acre doing that. Now, one of the first projects we did was a project called York Square. This was in Yorkville. To most people, it was a slum. It had no possibilities. Our developer couldn't get financing to tear it down and redo it. And so we went the route of renovation, of saving 8 or 9 old houses, these in the front, and building a U-shaped building around a big maple tree in the back. Now, the bylaw in Toronto, and if you look at, forget this drawing, but look at these two, the area around the outside of that is the same as the area on the inside. Our bylaw permitted only one thing, was a detached building standing in the middle of the site. So York Square became the prototype, the argument of, in fact, in often its cases, it's better to build at the street edge and make the sidewalk in the street and then provide urban courts within that. And you'll see there's a whole series of court housing. This was a great success in many ways, great propaganda hit. It became the kind of rallying point in the city. People could point to a prototype and say, look, see, you can save old houses, and he didn't lose his shirt. You can combine old and new. And we had some fun with graphics and so forth. And the interesting thing is how rich the play of the old things like fire escapes, the old houses against the new. And obviously the idea of structuring small spaces, which are intimate and protected in the city, which allow kind of all kinds of things to happen, from shopping, from eating, to actually doing performances. This is the Toronto Dance Group. And we had a good time. We did a lot of tongue-in-cheek things like circles for windows and doors for doors. And those days, very naughty things like the column. This shows how dated I am. The column doesn't line up with the mullions. Well, you've heard that before. And cheap components. And we took the attic of one of the houses because no one thought that was going to be a very attractive space. And we made it into our first office with a nice deck that looked over the square where we'd watch the girls. And it was very good. We lasted about 2 years, and then our rents went up, and we had to move. Next building is called the Annex, and this followed right on top of York Square. We were lucky to get something so quickly. And it was the headquarters for the Medical Association. This is equivalent to the AMA, but we have a local called OMA. And they were the toughest clients we've ever had. There were 40 doctors, and you can imagine 40 doctors trying to make a decision. 2 architects or something, but 40 doctors. And basically, again, this was prototypical of the kind of zoning that encouraged the destruction, high density in the middle of the block. We were able to develop an alternative to that and build low around the court, and again to continue the exploration of ordinary kind of building, but taking those elements and very carefully, not in a kind of Hardy Holtzman, splash it all over the place, but carefully, a very restrained way of making them part of the architecture. In this case, it's all vertical run feeders. We have no horizontal ducts except for this one boardroom. The rest of it's built into mixing boxes and so forth. And of course, we saved about 8 or 10 feet on the building height. And obviously, the tour de force was the boardroom where those ducts come in and make the light, and there's skylighting. And this conference room table is as large as that at NATO in Brussels. That's why that circular thing came about, because we couldn't fit the doctor's boardroom in the building anymore. All of our offices, all of our buildings at least give everyone the choice of natural light, so that the secretaries always have the choice. You can always wall yourself in, but we begin with the access and choice of natural light. Again, simple components, these lighting fixtures, bent rails integrated together. Here's a normal system of the air coming down by the column into the mixing box, into storage areas, and you can see the amount of space I've saved in the building. All of that standard duct works. The only thing we did is we had it put in as a finish item rather than a preliminary item. They were baked in a factory and then assembled. Okay, now we've demonstrated 2 low-rise high-density projects. We were asked by the Canadian National Television Program station network to do a special program on housing. We got 30 minutes of national time to demonstrate some of our ideas. And we took an area in downtown Toronto which was under the gun to be destroyed for high-density housing. And as I mentioned, the bonus system allowed you 2 20-story towers or a big slab, or if you had more open space, you got a 40-plus tower. Now, this is all equivalent to about 150 dwelling units an acre. And so we looked at how we might be able to save these areas. And notice how good the housing is. All the things you want to do in housing exist right here. If I can digress a minute. Define space, street address, identity of the unit, marvelous kind of townscape not being produced. No bonus system for Joe's, the barber, or the Chinese grocer, or for the church. In fact, where those people go, as you know, is always a problem. The whole culture that's built up for years and years about credit is destroyed, and these people are forced to fend with 2 and 3 cars in the suburbs. Again, the deep lot situation in the unutilized backyards provided one alternative, and we were able to demonstrate a whole series of alternatives from doing nothing, which is always important. Is the first thing you do is you do nothing, and then you build up, to an intensification where we could put housing down the laneway, parking underneath for the whole block, and we could get up to 60 dwelling units an acre and accommodate families. Street address, identification, car access, no elevators, good territorial definition, so forth. We could do family units. The other thing is you didn't have to acquire the whole block. You can see the church could be saved as a daycare center, a little York Square shopping. The street is not disrupted. The community could get together and form a non-profit group and do it themselves. Each person could sell off the land as equity and do the project, and so there were just numerous things you could do. I mean, it worked in so many ways. You could have small guys do it instead of the big developers. I mean, there were just many kind of ways that it worked. And obviously, the proximity between the new and the old is the same. But, in fact, the fence line is exactly where the garage is, so this guy's depreciable space is not changed. This is the kind of mix and integration that you get between old and new, which most of you should know is one of the best design devices around. Then there were other alternatives. If the block was too late to save the housing, then obviously you could put a middle density next to a park, and you could get stacked town housing. At least you maintain the tradition of the street. And then there was a series of arcaded housing, which was reminiscent of the hub building, where you get townhouses on the bottom, apartments above, and an internal shopping, so you maintain the residential quality. But you combine and structure the open space instead of leaving that kind of arid no man's land that exists at the bottom of high-rise towers. Now, out of that, three prototypical block types, which work to Toronto blocks. The top one is the one I just showed you, where the new housing occurs in the backyards, and you use the air rights of the lane. And you can see the section of that. That gets very high density, 100 to 150 DU per acre if you have to, but generally around 50 and 60 works pretty well. The middle one is a block that's just been completed by us. It's a hydro block. And this side, one side is removed where the housing was not good, and the density transferred in the 5 and 6 story. But these houses are renovated, and they really look super. And the nice thing is all of this is for low-income housing. It's all one peg up from public housing. Then the bottom one, which I'm going to show you, is the Dundas Sherwin, which is probably the weirdest one you'll ever see. And I don't recommend it as a prototype, although in principle it's a good idea. Here, where we're building in the backyards, like I showed you earlier, and this gray is where we're building, this is an alternative to a 30-story tower. It's 150 DU per acre. And it's this section here, it's 5 and 6 story housing put in the backyards. Now, what actually happened was that we actually got the chance to do this. All that propaganda and all that yakking and yelling and writing and getting in trouble finally paid off. This is the Southern Panzer Division, which is moving from the south, and there's a northern one up here that's moving in on these blocks. They were boarded up like this. The government said there's no way anyone can live in those houses. They're slums. They should be torn down. The community came to the city and said, would you please help us? And the city said, well, we don't have the technique. They went out for proposal calls. We got the job. We had 14 days to do the economics and the alternatives. The developers didn't want to play ball. They said, look, you like red buildings. We like blue buildings. We have the right to do blue buildings. You can't stop us. They moved with bulldozers. Jane Jacobs went down and knocked the hoarding down. And when the hoarding is down, they can't build. And it was fantastic. Anyway, the province and the city responded to the political pressures, purchased a lot, and then we were hired to do the economics and the housing. Basically what we do, depending on what the case is, we look at every alternative, and these were the first alternatives of 2 16-story towers. These are measured against a series of economic alternatives, and in this case, and you can't read it, but it's there just to make you look impressive, the cheapest alternative is to save the old and add to it. And everybody was a doubting Thomas and said, no, you can't do that. We said, yes, you can, and we got a chance, and we did it. And now everybody agrees that saving the old and is much cheaper. And it's going to be cheaper. In fact, the future, most of you are going to be recycling buildings. Now, here's the model of the scheme. We have an apartment building to the south that handles roomers and senior citizens and so forth. We have family units to the top, families on the ground floor, and smaller apartments above. And the idea is there is segregation between the two, and there's clearly defined routes between the two. Shopping here, and I've forgotten the exact number of families, but it has a high percentage. It's one of the advantages of the horizontal low-rise schemes are the access to ground and gardens. Now, this is an aerial view from one of the high-rises to the south. There's that Northern Panzer Division up there I was telling you about, moving south. And you can see that we've just put the stuff in the backyards. And one of the nice comments we get from community groups is to say the things actually look like our drawings. I thought, that was the purpose, but that's not necessarily so. Here's a cross-section. The houses, families on the ground floor with fenced-off defined territory. There's Sherman Street. There's an interior lane. There's a rear lane. We have a townhouse on the ground floor with its garden, courtyard. We have a horizontal deck, a walkway, with a small unit, and then a staircase to a through unit. We have the same repeating element in 6 floors. Everybody gets through ventilation. Everybody gets defined balcony or ground space. And it was built for the same price as those standard high-rises. In fact, it's a high-rise on its side. These are the fronts after they've been finished. Obviously, I mean, you had to be pretty dumb not to recognize they're going to turn out beautifully. In fact, they were the finest houses in Toronto at one time. And the satisfying thing is, again, that it's basically a low-income project. 50% of the project is rent supplement. It's a nonprofit housing corporation, which means that they don't make a profit. It's plowed back into it. It's the City of Toronto's first housing project. And the City of Toronto has its own housing commission, builds nonprofit housing for low-income families in the city, where they're owned and operated by community groups in the city jointly. And it's quite an impressive program. They trying to average 2,000 housing units a year. These old houses are spectacular. You can't build this back into architecture. You can't afford it. I mean, only Walt Disney can do it. And you can see we try to get little decks on the back so everybody has a place to get to the outside. And it's, by all standards, a very urban scheme. Now, I've got some slides that are out of place. I'm sorry. You'll catch some more Dundas Sherburne a little later, I found when I was loading it. Okay, that was out of place. You shouldn't have seen that yet, but anyway. The next one we got was an interesting job of a major campus, the University of Alberta, and we were fortunate not to be able to start from scratch, and we were fortunate that the campus did not have aspirations to be the Acropolis, and so we weren't able to produce an architecture that looked like that. Instead, we had a campus that looks like most cities. It's mostly an open parking lot, built on a 15% occupancy of its land, tremendous open space, very bad logistics, expanding from 15 to 30,000, and designed for the summer and works during the winter. And we couldn't get the people to go to school in the summer and not go to school in the winter. Now, not going to talk about that because it's a long process, but basically we did the campus as a lesson in urban form. We did a consolidation campus. We infill, we married new buildings and old buildings to make gallerias to hook people up. We produced some very interesting policies. It's one of the first campuses that has a commercial policy. It's the first campus that has supported public transportation, where the bus goes to the heart of the campus and the car is put into parking garages, and I'll show you that in a minute. The first campus to really come to grips with a housing policy saying, yes, we're in the housing business. It has something to do with the kind of university we have. And not only that, we have choices. It should be choices of type, location, and administration, which meant that the students' union could lease land from the university and build their own housing. In fact, the students own and operate 2 buildings worth $12 million at the University of Alberta. So it's quite unique. What we did was, this green building here existed as chemistry. We put the new green building along and made a galleria, an arcade. And we used buildings not only to meet the faculty need, but each building contributes to a kind of idea in the master plan or the long-range plan. We have about 8 arcades or gallerias built. In fact, all those red buildings are new buildings. Something like 165 million in construction in a very short time. This is typical of an old building. You can't see the roof in the slide. There's a glass roof so that you can promenade through gallerias and not in tunnels on the ground, which have been normally the solution in Canada, is to put students with the moles, with the service pipes. Now this is typical of what's called general academic structures. There's food services, as they call them. Terrible name, but anyway, food services, pedestrian at grade, academic and then office buildings above, mixed-use buildings built very inexpensively. Each one contributes to the arcaded system. Now, the students came to us and said, look, we like your ideas about the campus. This is after they'd gone through a very extensive selection process. And it chose us. And so we like your ideas, but we can always get a developer and go off campus and build a high-rise. But we'll give you an opportunity to do something, providing you meet the same cost. Now, we're not interested in fancy housing. We want apartments. We want them cheap. We want rents can't exceed $45 a person, a lot of tough constraints. But if you can do the things you want to do, where housing, which pays for itself, it's self-amortizing, where housing could be used to make the major connection systems. Because in normal university planning, the formula of financing doesn't permit the other buildings to do that. So the housing policy helped us not only use housing on campus as a connector system, but by being able to have a mixed use, putting the greasy spoons back on campus, those hot dog things and pizza places that normally universities displace, they help subsidize the housing too, because they are revenue producing. And so the housing is seen as not only a physical connector, but also a major supplier of services and hopefully doing some social integration. Now, the Canadian has developed the most extraordinary ability to build high-rise concrete frame structures. In fact, I think outside of the Soviets, it's probably the cheapest kind of construction. They've done the best job at it. And simply, this is the new balloon frame for Canada from Vancouver through Alberta to Toronto. They can throw these towers up, these apartment buildings. Now, the way we start, and again, you're probably too far away, every project starts with a development model. Simply, what kind of rents can you get that's translated into what kind of building can you build? And with the kind of clients we have, if they're shopping for a Volkswagen, you can't sell them a BMW. So this is basically a Volkswagen building. Probably it's American Motors would be closer to it. And we then take that and we translate that into 14 elements. This is an elemental cost system. It's an English system which has been adapted in Canada. It will soon be exported to the United States when they get wise enough to understand how good it is. And it's saved our lives. That we've generally been within 3 to 5% of all our budgets. And what we do is we analyze a standard apartment building, and then we try to see if we can match those costs. It also means that in the first element, which is substructure, if you get in the foundation problems, you got to compensate somewhere else. What it does is an open book examination of what things cost, where you're spending your money, and it becomes a very good design tool for the client because he can make those tough decisions. We've now got this on an operating cost computer where we can now talk about energy and operating costs so that you not only can look at capital expenditure, but you can look at operating costs at the same time. Now, the result was this housing project, which is basically row housing built over an existing street. And I should have gone back to that section. But there's simply 2 row houses built over a street with a galleria roof, shopping at the base, and apartments above. And let me go back a couple there. You can see it here. 1 row house here, 1 row house here. They're pushed together, so the shortest perimeter distance is the roof. So this can be inside. Starting at the top, there's a 4-person apartment with a studio, 2-story height, 2-person apartment. Each one of these has kitchen, bathroom, self-contained. Everybody has a private room. Then at the base here, they can be apartments or shops and boutiques. One side is left open for natural ventilation, which reduces all of our ventilation costs for garage. And then there are bachelor apartments that come down this side. It's simply, as I mentioned, 2 row houses pushed together and was built for $15 a square foot in 1972. So it was built for the same price. You would be taking your normal cheap apartment building today and doing the same thing. So we were delighted on how lucky we were on that. In fact, we knew we weren't lucky. We knew it was going to work. Anyway, from the air, it looks like the longest diner in the West. And you can see that, there are high-rise buddies springing up all over the place. From the ground, it makes courts and spaces. Actually, the court that's produced where we're standing is about the size of the great court at Cambridge. You can see flat plate, beam. This is the American system of the jacks, the trays for pouring the concrete. We went right over an existing street, saved the trees on one side, put 500 piles in, only put one through an electrical closet. And then you can see the roof coming on. The end is left open for connections. There'll be a connection to the fine arts here. This is maintained as a service tunnel and short-term parking. The trees are maintained on this side and a walkway. You can see some of the connections. On this side of the campus, we do jump up to a +15.
Yeah, it is. This is a really neat place.
Now, these are,
I like this guy.
what I did is that roof you saw in my house was a each brawn. I got the greenhouse people to bid against the skylight people. And then I got local manufacturers also to put in components. We got this roof for $6 a square foot with double glazing, firmly broken skylight. It's 957 feet, 30,000 square feet for $175,000. Staggering. And the way we did it was simply getting those bids. We got a local guy to buy the acrylic from Ron-Gloss and then blow them in Edmonton, and we got a local fabricator. And the only leak we have is over the Students' Union Championship pool table. I'll never let you forget that. These are a series of shops and boutiques. These are early shots, and it's actually it's transformed a lot in about 5 or 6 years. The idea is the best kind of meeting place, the best kind of places to talk about architecture and so forth are often sidewalk cafes. So we're trying to put a little bit of the city back into the university. Simple shop fronts. Each unit has a kind of Dutch door system. They're referred to as the laugh-in doors. And we've got just about everything but the laundry stretched across the mall. We get that. The negative drawback we have is one of acoustics, obviously. And that although it's quieter in a decibel rating than any street that you'd ever live on, because you don't have traffic, there's a different kind of sound. And one person can hang out a hi-fi speaker, and he's got 957 feet of the most fantastic reverberation panels. So immediately we say he goes to jail. But laundries, daycare centers, the whole works are there. Okay, we're jumping up the next scale. This was a project, the kind of recent work we're doing. This is the city of Regina, which is 150,000, growing slowly. And just to give you some indication of what that urban sprawl means, Regina is 35 square miles. Its next annexation will take in 46 square miles. And that's simply just to house, more houses of 3 and 5 dwelling units an acre. Now, we were asked to look at the possibilities that if the federal government financed rail yard relocation, what could happen with those lands. And the yellow grid shows the distribution patterns of those lines and rail yards. There are two big ones, what's called the CN project, the CP project, and the CN, Canadian Pacific, Canadian National. We were hired to look at one of the yards, but prototypically we looked at the whole system, and it was fantastic, the distribution of the city. The whole area, 500 and some acres combined, is bigger than the city. And this gave us a chance really to look at the density and distribution model. Now, previous planners had talked about LRT and fancy systems, and we suspected that if we could take the buses and we could use these for bus routes and give the bus the same kind of efficiency, we'd have a very flexible vehicle. And we then asked what kinds of housing, what kind of densities would you need in these corridors to really make the bus work, and what do you do to get people onto the bus? We chose the Sudbury Mercedes bus because in Regina, they're very car-oriented, just like you are. And so the slogan was, take a Mercedes downtown and leave your Cadillac at home. So
So these are kind of things, what should we do with these 70 acres? Well, we didn't know any more than anyone else did about what to do. So we didn't suspect that we could use these roots. And after a very interesting, exhaustive study, we looked at